The word intimacy is an interesting term, right? Depending on who you talk to, people have very different ideas about what that word means. And certainly one of those ideas is the idea of sex and sexuality. But we also know that intimacy is way bigger than that, right? It involves so many more aspects and more details. But as a pastor and a leader of people, one of the things you are going to realize is that when it comes to intimacy in the form of sex and sexuality, this is a huge piece, not only in our personal lives as individuals, trying to become healthier, but also in the lives of those we're leading. It's so important that we understand this idea and this topic in a healthy biblical way, and that we're ready and willing to have conversations about it, not only with our own hearts, but with the people that we're leading. And so over the next few videos, we want to dive into this topic and wrestle through it. And here's what I hope to do. I hope to, number one, maybe challenge some of the ways that you've thought about the issue of sex and sexuality. Number two, my hope is that we would maybe be willing to rethink some of those ideas from a biblical perspective. And then lastly, my hope is to provide some hope to you in ways that we can think about these things in our own life, and also as we are willing and open to discuss it and teach it and work through it with the people that we're leading. I hope that we leave this place filled with hope and understanding in new ways in the area of sex, intimacy, in our own personal lives. So I want to dive into that, and we're going to start off by talking about a concept, which is this: sex is never about sex. Now, the church has had an interesting relationship with the issue of sex and sin. In fact, if you go back and remember when I grew up in youth ministry, I remember the main topic of that time when it came to the church talking about sex was abstinence, right? I remember hearing countless speakers that would even travel the whole country and do school seminars, and they would talk about abstinence and how important it is and what it looks like. And I remember sitting through presentations where they would pass around a rose and everyone would handle it, and by the end they'd say, see, this is what you'll be like, a crumpled up rose if you are promiscuous. And there's a lot of people that lived through that and came out of that really damaged by the things that they heard and the perceptions they had about themselves and their own sexuality. But then the church kind of moved on into a new topic, which was the topic of homosexuality. And we started to address that, and we started to talk about that and preach about that. And of course, many of us are aware of some of the damage that was done in the way that the church as a whole handled that issue, talked about that issue, and dealt with those who were struggling with that issue. And now we're kind of in a new era where both those first two issues are really not talked about much. Now we're in the area of the topic of transgender. And we're kind of filled with the opportunity, sometimes yes, sometimes no, of talking about what it means to be the church, what the Bible says in the area of sexuality and transgenderism. And so we've kind of morphed over time. But one thing that I think has been true, again, not in every church or every situation, every person, but one of the things that's been true is oftentimes these areas have left a lot of damage in their wake. The way that we've understood them, the way that we've talked about them, and the way that we've dealt with them even in our own lives has sometimes been not the best. And so one of the things that I've realized as I've looked at this issue and worked through it and thought about it is many of my perceptions about sex and sexuality were actually wrong. And I was misunderstanding what the Bible is really saying. And so today I want to share a little bit about that idea with you. And the idea is this: that sex is never about sex. So if we're going to talk about these areas in our own lives and to the people we're leading properly, we have to first understand our misconception. And I think one of the misconceptions that we have is that sex is this purely physical or biological thing. So when we talk about areas like sin and struggle and all those things, in our minds, this is just a biological, physical issue. And so therefore the solutions that we look at and the way that we talk about it becomes very simplified. And sometimes we can even misdiagnose the problem and misdiagnose solutions because we are simplifying, overly simplifying this idea, right? But I would challenge you to think deeper about the area of sex. And what I would say is, based on what the Bible tells us about being created and made in His image, we are not just physical, biological beings, but we're also spiritual beings. And when it comes to the area of sex and sexuality, there is this crossover and connection between our physical selves and our spiritual selves, which means when we talk about sexual issues in our life, we have to understand that they're far deeper than just a physical, chemical, biological response. But the reason why we feel things like sexual stimulation and attraction, the reason why we have struggle, the reason why pornography is so addicting and so many other issues, those reasons are not just a physical, biological, chemical reaction, but they're actually this connection between our spiritual selves and our physical selves. So the idea that sex is never about sex is rooted really in the Genesis creation account. See, we have to understand something about all of sin and all of struggle, right? In the creation account, God made Adam and Eve, and he made them in his image. And they're in this perfect identity. He gives them an identity, right? And part of the identity was to tend to the garden. It was to commune with God. And then we know because of sin entering the world, their identity is now disjointed. And from that point on, for all of humanity, you have this fractured relationship with identity. We see it throughout the Old Testament with the nation of Israel, right? Where they had this identity of the people of God, but yet they're constantly swaying and looking for identity in other things. And every time they did that, they got off track, and then God rebukes them and tries to get them back on track. This theme throughout all of Scripture is this: all of humanity is searching for identity. We're searching for something that would give us a sense of value and worth. And so when it comes to the area of sexuality, what it tells us, and really this is true of all sin, that sin is not just an issue of behavior, but ultimately it's an issue of believing. Or another way to put it is an issue of beholding. What do I behold? What do I worship? And so the inclination of the human heart is to try to find identity, and we will use things to do that. We will worship things all around us. So in the Old Testament, they talk about idolatry, and we kind of sometimes think about that as being this old school barbaric idea that we've moved past. But in reality, the human heart is still conditioned the same way. We look to worship things that we think will give us a sense of value and worth. So some people, it could be money, some people, it could be power, success, all different things. But we think if I could get this, if I could just achieve this, this will finally make me feel worthwhile, right? It's idolatry. It's the idols in our heart. I think it's Jonathan Edwards that says our hearts are idol factories. We're constantly looking to worship things that we think will give us identity. And so when that is the framework for all of sin, including sexuality, it helps us better understand that when we talk about sex, we're not actually really just talking about the act of sex or some physical expression. What we're talking about is what is taking place in the human heart. What is taking place in the heart of worship within us? What are we actually looking for in these moments? And I would posit the idea that in every single one of these situations, we are desperately looking and searching for something that we think will give us a sense of value and worth. Now, one of my favorite books is called You Can Change by Tim Chester. And in that book, he lays out and says this idea: that every human heart worships one of four primary source idols. And all of sin, all struggle can be rooted in one of these four source idols. And so the idols are number one, power; number two, approval; number three, security; and number four, comfort. And what his thesis is, and I think I agree with him, is that all of our struggle, all of the things that we go through, including sex and sexuality, can be boiled down and rooted into one of these four idols. And the reason why this is important in understanding for all the conversation is because here's what it means. Behavior is not a good indication of sin, right? If I give offering, I could go to church and put money in the offering plate, and my motivation for doing that is because I love Jesus, I love what our church is doing, I'm excited, and that would be a good thing. But I could also go to church and put money in the offering plate, and my motivation is that I want to be noticed by the people around me, I want to gain power in the church, I want to have a position of influence, and that very same act or behavior would be considered sinful or wrong, right? The behavior stayed the same, but the motivation was completely different. What this means for us is that behavior is not a good indicator of sin. In fact, it's far deeper. And so as we get into the rest of our videos and we start talking about sex and sexuality, it's important that we start with this framework, that sex is never just about sex. There's something far deeper happening in the human heart. It's really connected to our deep desire to worship, our deep desire to find something other than Jesus to give us identity, worth, and value. And here's why this is important for you. Number one, personally, for your own life, you may think, I don't have any struggles in this area, and then maybe as we dive into this, you're going to realize that maybe you do. Or maybe you do know you have struggles. Maybe you're struggling right now personally. And this concept and these ideas are going to help you cultivate and work through your own sexuality, your own sexual struggles, the own reality in your life from a gospel-centered point of view. So for you as an individual, becoming a healthier person and healthier leader, this is important. But it's also important because you lead people. There's people around you that you have influence over. And how we conduct ourselves, how we communicate to them, how we talk to them about these issues matters. So my hope is in our next video, we're going to do a deep dive into these 4 idols, and we're going to learn how do we examine our own hearts and help those around us understand that sex is really never just about sex.